The Ball Theory of Christianity, based on the work of Glenn Young. Ball and Christianity, Part 3. The premise. Baal, the god portrayed in the Old Testament as the great rival of God Yahweh, whose worship was considered by the prophets as an abomination, is in fact the model for the Christ story. And Christianity is a morphed version of the Baal legend and not a reformed version of Judaism, nor a new covenant with the God Yahweh. We need to know the real history and not the tales of the Bible. So many are under the illusion that the Bible is a historical document and thus historically accurate. It is not. It is a literary work. That's how it's classified, and that's exactly what it is, as all sacred writings are. They may contain history in them, but they themselves are not a history book. Now, at least from 15,000 BC and lasting in many places till about 1500 BC, organized religion is based in the worship of the great Earth Mother alone in many, many cases, and then others at the top of the hierarchy of many of the pantheons of the gods. In these places, there is little evidence of the concept of a sky god, or in fact, any male deity. And that's important to remember. Now, the dominance of the mother goddess began to erode as early as 6000 BC and almost ended in the West by 1200 AD. This presents a real dilemma, because when you see a concerted effort to begin to erase, remove, alter, forge history, particularly when it deals with our species, that becomes a problem. Now, here's the reality of it. Nothing in religion really ever goes away. Case in point, how they replaced the female goddess in today's modern religion called Christianity is that Mary is the veneration in the West that keeps the mother goddess tradition alive. How many of the Catholic faith pray to Mary as an intermediary, a go-between? How many of the great miracles have been witnessed by thousands of the image of Mary, the mother goddess? Nothing has changed. Now, from 6000 BC to 2500 BC, the Phoenician religion, among others, evolves out of the mother goddess religion to incorporate the general religious views of Mesopotamia and Egypt, which was really a blending of hierarchies. We were seeing where the patriarch was now replacing the matriarchal concept. And that was representative very much in both of these cultures, which was dominating what I would call much of the world's belief system. Now, what is absent here is the effect of the Far East. And it's one of the things that has always amazed me was the fact that when you read about the so-called cradle of modern civilization, it's definitely one-sided because it does not include what we now know of the vibrant civilizations in China, Japan, the Aborigines down in Australia, Indonesia, South America. Indonesia, when you think about it, has a whole new species dedicated to it. Then we also have the Americas. Now, the religion became greatly influenced by the sky god concepts of the Indo-Europeans and the Semites. Who are the Semites? They are the remnants of what later, if you take the story of their distant cousins coming out of Egypt. The Semites, as you will learn, also bred with the Asians. It was the Phoenicians who took the sky god concept to most of Europe. So you can see how the blending began to work. Now, the sky god religion was the male dominant pantheon of gods with specialized deities, gods of war, gods of love, gods of spells. If you read and if you go along with the story of the Watchers, the fallen angels, they're the ones who taught women how to put on makeup and began to teach, man how to make jewelry and how to paint their lips. And it goes on and on. So you can see how this goes. Now, a reference to this is a history of the ancient Near East. Great book, textbook, but it's a good one. With the Great Mother still worshipped by and in a secondary role. It was never meant to be a Father God and then a Son and then a Holy Spirit, or how this thing has morphed today. That's not how it was supposed to be. But that's how it has become. Now, the key deities in this morphing now of belief systems is that there is the sun god. Obviously, that would be critical. And one that would directly impact every person, weather. Gods of storms. And that was Baal. Much of the religious stories are based on astrological movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and weather observations. You want to know why? Because this was even more important than the worship of the gods. Crops. Now, you had to have the thumbs up from the gods, that's what you were betting on. But really what it came down to was the observation of the astrological movement of the sky. When to plant the crops, when to harvest the crops, when was the rain supposed to come. All of this played a critical role. And because it played such a critical role in the development of our species, it's very easy to see how the gods would be incorporated into such a vital part of the necessity of life itself. Not that difficult to really figure out. So the sky god view, multiple gods. The gods are responsible for all acts, as I was just saying. Gods at first looked like animals, then became like men. Now, if you read a lot of the different books that are out there, I would recommend the Bronze books. Great book to understand. The Emerald Tablets. Just a lot of these other documents, books, sacred writings. You will begin to see that the gods were animals to begin with. And then they became like men. And then they became supermen, superwomen. Now, as this was going, sacrifices needed and were required for many occasions. Just a sample, to gain support of the gods for war or new business ventures. Very critical. Back in those days, in fact, today, it's still used for such. To placate an angry or, I love this one, disinterested God. You know, if you're in an area of drought, well, what'd you do to, upset the gods? Or if you saw an invading army coming, we're going to learn later in this presentation, that's where a lot of worship lies at this. The last one, to seal a deal between two different states and to ensure that the gods between the individuals is satisfied. And the way that this was done was called a covenant. Now, many people are familiar with the covenant, the Adamic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Davinical covenant. It goes on and on. All forms accepted, including human sacrifice. At times, the firstborn sacrifice seems standard. As you read, it was not foreign to them. Our ancestors, us. Other human sacrifices were used in time of crisis or major contracts. Nothing more to seal an agreement between two opposing parties than a human sacrifice. As politics developed, it was the politics that influenced the religion, not the religion that influenced the politics. Much akin today. But don't be deceived. The religion does hold the upper hand until the upper hand is cut off. So from about 3000 BC to 250 BC, the religion of Phoenicia is a major influence in the southern Mediterranean basin, dominating North Africa, the major islands of the western Mediterranean, and half of what is now Spain. You see, the expansion of civilization, as brought out in part 2, begins to show how much, and by the way, if you do the simple math of populations alone, then this small little state called the Judea area was, by comparison, minimal in its impact. Today, we have it kind of reversed. Now, the influence spreads from the Phoenician to the mainland Europe and to what is now England, and guess what? It is now appearing more and more the Phoenicians made it to the Americas. And very well established trading posts. That's what they did. We know the Druids of Britain, as well as other Celtic religions, are all based on Baal. Human sacrifice is common, often by burning, such as the Wicker Man tradition. Now, if you don't know what the Wicker Man is, check it out. What they used to do is that literally they would build these large representations of a man, and they would put people at the top of it and set it on fire. The Wicker Man. Now, these areas were Baalist far longer than they were in their conversion, a very recent in time of becoming Christians. The Eastern Mediterranean was faced with many political crises. It seems to be an ever-repeating loop. We look into history and we can see this. We can see it in the written history. We can see it in the archaeological record. From about 1600 to 1200 BC, the invasion of the Hyksos and then later the Sea People, along with other nomadic people, devastated the Eastern Mediterranean areas. Now, if you read about the Hyksos, they were in fact a Semitic Asian mixed breed. And you can begin to, when you study history, begin to see how the Far East began to influence the Mideast, not the other way around. And the Sea People, now these were a confederation of nomadic seafarers. Isn't that odd? We don't think about it at that time of history. I mean, we're coming out of the Bronze Age. And yet, there were confederations, and when they came together, they became a very powerful invading force. Took down Egypt. I mean, Greece. Now, while the Hittites and the Mycenaean Greece and the Minoan cultures fell, and parts of Egypt was ruled by the Hyksos for 400 years, you're beginning to see how this began to change the whole culture. And oddly enough, Phoenicia was able to defend themselves against the invaders, and they actually became stronger, more prosperous, more influential. They did pay a price for this. They did lose control of a small area of Canaan to what was now a race of people called the Hebrews. And history is not clear on the exactness of how this happened. The Bible gives one story, but again, we often find that what sometimes the Bible is saying is not actually, particularly in the Old Testament, is not actually what is reality. So Phoenicia survives the Sea People and becomes more independent and more dominant in the Mediterranean area, credited with its success in the crisis, and the great expansion of the culture was the gods of the Phoenicia, Baalism. Therefore, in real history, from about 2000 BC to 700 BC, the dominant world religion in all of the Mediterranean area is, in fact, the religion of the Phoenicians, or the Canaanites. That of the Phoenician, the pantheon, with Baal as the storm god, which was later adapted and modified by the Greeks to be known as Zeus. That was later modified by the Italians, or what we now became Latin for Iusus, which today is a derivation of the word Jesus. Now, we know that this actually happened. We've seen the pictographs that have been found throughout Egypt. The Egyptians talk about this invasion and how it was the end for their culture, as most invasions are. So let's put Yahweh in the right perspective. The historical fact, those who were to become Hebrews, then the children of Israel, then the Jews, at that time were part of the Baalist expansion and were basically an unimportant, isolated group of Sinites. The fact is, around 1100 to 1000 BC, and perhaps as late as 900 BC, in the highlands of what is now the Holy Land, a small and unimportant area of the Phoenician influence, this is where the cult of Yahweh started. And it was modeled greatly on the Phoenician religion, Baalism. Even the Bible says that Abram, in his time, and if you can, and that's the problem with dealing in timelines, particularly in the Bible. So roughly we have to look at what the archaeological evidence is and then look at the folklore. But it was roughly anywhere from about 1900 BC to they estimate to about 1600 BC. But again, there's no evidence of this at all. But The legend and the story says that Abram worshiped his goddess Sin, known also as Nana. That's what his family did. They made idols. He lived in Ur of the Chaldees, a Samaritan capital. Abram was a Samaritan. Now, at some point in time, he changed and began to worship El, which is shown in the Ugarit writings, and was the chief god of the Canaanites. According to tradition, Yahweh gains his name only with Moshe at Mount Sinai, which was between 12 and 1400 BC, if you go on that. Could be later. The Yahweh cult in this time is seen as a minor religion variation of a minor Semitic people. That's all it was. We know now from the translations of the Phoenician text that before the time of the Bible, Yahweh was a brother of Baal. Yahweh had a wife, a lesser god of the Phoenician pantheon, one of 70 other brothers of Baal. Now, is this a coincidence that there is 70 different names for the Jewish God? Evidence shows over time this more isolated group of people adopted Yahweh as their chief god over another brother known as Baal. What modern archaeological digs have shown is that the Yahweh followers, late in the 9th century BC, created two small, very disunited states split over the religion issues. Much different reality than what the Bible teaches. And again, there was, in fact, never a great united Israel under a king known as David and Solomon. There's no evidence of any such state existing other than what's in the Bible. Little of the stories told in the Bible of the conquest of the Holy Land by the followers of Yahweh can be validated by any research. Most findings are in strong contradiction to the stories of the Bible. So what can we prove? Well, far more evidence to support the stories of Achilles than David or Solomon. We know the ruins of the Messenian and Troy. We can find their ruins. We can find their palaces. We can find their temples. But there's no evidence of the first temple of David's kingdom that has ever been found. And again, despite what the Christians, and in this case the Jews, would have us believe, a false folk history, the first 5 books of the Bible, for instance, was developed to justify Yahweh's followers and their claim to power and domination of the land that was for centuries, probably maybe even millennia, belonged to the Canaanites and Baalists. Jews, by the way, never wrote the creation story. It was stolen from the Chaldeans' account and not the account of Yahweh. As with most religions, most of the foundation stories, Bible stories of Abraham all the way to the time of Joshua, were taken from other peoples with a few name changes and based on many religious and political traditions that were already very ancient. This technique, this trickery, is also what is used in the New Testament. The focus of the stories, the critical stories, once the storyline brought them into the Canaanite lands, was this. There's a rivalry between Yahweh and Baal, and how evil the followers of Baal were, and how wrong they were in the worship and beliefs. Because you see, they take in the fact that this was Yahweh's promise to Abram. But if you look in the historical record, well, it isn't adding up. Now, the only way you can begin to vilify your opponent is to do just that. Make them evil. So throughout the stories, the Old Testament, the jealous God, the vengeful God, the murderous God. Yes, this God has murder in its heart. Look at the book of Exodus, and it says Yahweh, Elohim, sought to kill Moshe. Well, we see it over and over now. Yahweh demands the killing of all the followers of Baal. And murder is murder, regardless of God or not. There are no exemptions. To further the record, Joshua is commanded to do so over and over again, to commit genocide. We read in the book of Joshua the stories of where they came into villages and not one living thing was left. Not human, not animal. And the women that were pregnant, their babies were cut out of their womb with their heads most of the time cut off while the mother was still alive. The prophet assails the Baalists mostly to no avail, except once, where Elijah defeats the priests of Baal and the priests are slaughtered. But somehow or another, he is driven into exile for doing so. Much later, the Christians use this directive for murdering against the others on a worldwide scale, 250 million and counting. Now, the other religions of the world, they got their counts as well, and all the counts are high. So this is depiction. Now, again, there's no evidence that this ever happened, but it does give one pause, does it not? Who was really raining the fire down? So, the creation of the Hebrew states. Now, between 900 and 650 BC, in the region of what is known today as the Holy Land, the struggles developed between the followers of Yahweh cultus and the broader Baalist religion, both within and between the small states established in this area. Now, you can read these stories. They're in the Bible. You can read it in Josephus's accounts of the antiquities of the Jews. So, as this continued, you have to begin to look at there was more added to it. There were internal fights within the Yahweh cult over the real role of Yahweh. I mean, the question they were debating was, is he a god? Was he their god? Was he the chief of all the gods? Or was he the sole and only sole God? Much debate on this. The disputes also involved internal fights within the cult over, get this, the proper ways to offer prayers and sacrifices to Yahweh, and if and how to offer sacrifices to other gods. A clear reading of the Bible shows, as stated in Kings and in Chronicles, that many of the kings worship Baal and the other foreign gods. Big G. That the proponents of Yahweh are almost always in an inferior political position throughout this period. And as calamity does happen, well, these prophets were standing there and saying, we told you so. Whether they had anything to do with it or not. It still happens today. So the main conflict between Baal and Yahweh was this. The disputes between the Baalists and the Yahwists existed for a long time. The key questions do not seem to be in ritual, but who to worship. The religions were very similar in the type of worship, including sacrifice to gods through the burnt offering of both animal and human. However, late in the two Yahweh kingdom period, there developed a real controversy on the rituals of religion as well. While there seems to be a conflict over the temple prostitution and a few other minor issues, the main conflict seems to be to the issue of human sacrifice. At that time, in the kingdom's period, right up to their destruction, Bala seemed to practice it regularly. Most of the Yahwist kings and most people seem at that time to practice it as well. Only the Yahwist prophets denounced the practice, which continued. The prophet-dominated writings of the Bible show most of the Jewish kings did evil unto the Lord, which literally means Baal. Even today, Lord literally translates Baal. Worshipping foreign gods and passing their children through the fire. And passing children through the fire was the ritual of human sacrifice. Now, this is what its modern depiction of the Baal rituals. It is said that the act of abortion is worship of Baal, that we continue as our species to offer the virgin souls and spirits. Now, the origins of Jewish and Christian conflict on human sacrifice. We have been told for so long that the root conflict between Jews and Christians was non-acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah. That is the dividing line. Turns out may not be the case. This is partly true, but has been altered, and a very pro-Christian view has been put in its place. A key conflict between Christians and Jews at the time of the development of Christianity grows out of this conflict between the Yahwist and the Baalist over the issue of human sacrifice. This story is not told much since it appears to put the Christians in the Baalist camp of accepting the need for human sacrifice to please God, which they are, and which they did. The story of this sacrifice of this person on a cross is a human sacrifice. No matter how you say it. You can say that it was a god, you can say it was a deity, a hybrid, whatever. But in the foundation of the religious views and practices, it was human sacrificing. Now, you can frame it into whatever reference you want. Now, to understand the conflict over human sacrifice, we need to understand for a long and vast history of religion, human sacrifice was common and widespread and continued in non-Christian Europe well past 1000 AD, as was widely practiced in the New World until the European conquest. And for thousands of years, it was considered the highest and most important sacrifice to gods and used for the most important of events. If you were chosen, there was a time to be sacrificed, you reached deity. Many cultures, as they developed and ended the practice, created cover stories for the ancient practices. For instance, Romulus and Remus. Ditto of the Carthage, Abraham and Isaac. Others continued to practice under more forms, Roman gladiator games, China's terracotta warriors. It goes on. The key use of human sacrifices were for founding a city or a culture, a new covenant with a god, like Abraham did, and Isaac was required, securing an agreement between nations, assuring the continuation of natural rotation of life, the sun coming up, rains falling, appeasing God or the gods to gain results in war, or appeasing the gods or gods in times of crisis. We see human sacrifice in several writings of the ancient world as normal and needed, including Homer with the sacrifice of a young girl to allow the Greek fleet to sail off to Troy, and several times in the Bible where a judge pledges a sacrifice of a human for victory. Turns out it was his daughter. David sacrifices men to end a drought. The Moabite king sacrificing his son in front of the Israelite army. Here we see the daughter of Agamemnon being led to her sacrifice. She was not fearful. She was not afraid. It was an honor, a sacred blessing. Now, few modern scholars approach the subject. Good reason. If you look at Flaubert's, what he wrote in his novel of 1862, the result of the First Punic Wars, describing the sacrifice of children in the time of crisis. And every time that a child was placed in them, the priest of Moloch spread out their hands upon them to burden him with the crimes of the people. Well, we get that story also told about the scapegoat. Now you know where the practice came from. We can read in the Bible the story of David and Bathsheba and how the first son of their union after 8 days died. And David, as it is written, much to the confusion of the prophets, held a feast. Then the second child, Solomon, became the king. David celebrated the sacrifice of his son. Taken from very ancient viewpoints, this was a normal procedure. The first royal child is sacrificed to the gods. And so it appears that this interpretation fits the facts presented in the Bible. Human sacrifice was central to the Baalist religion practices, this worldwide religion as it became. There is debate about how often the process, but few deny that it was a core practice. This core practice was used through the Phoenician world for thousands of years. And from the writings in the Bible, when the kings did evil in the sight of God, the evil that was done was human sacrifice. So we really don't know how they actually did it, but this is the depiction of how it was done. And if so, well, listen, there's a Etruscan mural showing human sacrifice from the 7th century BC. Notice the winged angel creature present for the human sacrifice. Why is this? And for a long time, in the religion of the Yahwist, human sacrifice seemed to be acceptable and often required. God demands all the first fruits, including from people. Later verses modifies this to allow for the redemption of human children. The term used in the Bible for the highest form of sacrifice is uah, which was translated into Greek as Holocaust, and was seen in its time as referring to human sacrifice for God and God alone, so completely burnt. And we see it as the source of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. The sacrifice of Isaac has been one of the more confusing issues in the Bible based on modern thinking. Why would a man willingly sacrifice his child? Although according to the timeline of the Bible, Isaac would have been about 30 years old, the same age as Jesus. What type of God would demand such a thing? This is a rendition, an artist's rendition. Notice the angel. So, human sacrifice, to the minds of the ancients, seen from their point of view, based on thousands of years of tradition, the religion, God's request of Abraham to sacrifice his son, would have been a standard and not just acceptable, but a predictable event. Abraham and God were sealing the deal for the new covenant made with his God for all the lands promised to him with the sacrifice of his firstborn son. To the minds of the ancients, this would be standard operating procedure for Abraham's time and for thousands of years before and thousands of years more to come. In all likelihood, in the original story, Isaac was in fact sacrificed. And as a good God, to replace Isaac's sacrifice, Abraham had 5 more sons. This is told in multiple accounts of the Jewish, Islam, and Jewish Christianity stories and accounts of Abram. And it is clear that it is not only standard practice in the time of Abram, but right up into the time of Jesus and beyond. Some 1,500 years and more after the time of Abraham, Rome offered human sacrifices when Hannibal was at the gate. 212 BC, the defenders of Carthage were offering human sacrifices as the Romans besieged them, 150 BC. And Roman emperors conducted human sacrifice to Baal 150 years after the supposed death of Jesus Christ. And the death of Jesus Christ can be no other way but classified as a human sacrifice. Therefore, at the time of Jesus, the idea of sacrificing children to God was not new or different, even if the idea of God having his own son sacrificed was not new or different. It was ancient and standard practice for the time. What was different was the Jews and how their beliefs were changed. History is a shaper of religion. To understand how the conflict over sacrifice and humans is perhaps the core conflict between Christians and Jews, we need to know the real social and political history of the time, something not taught in the Christian-dominated culture. Once again, we need to know the real history and how that history helped to morph what we see today in the existing religions. We need to understand how the many crises of the time impacted both the followers of Baal and Yahweh. This is the end of part 3.